All right, and welcome to another installment of the Five Star Podcast of Wrestling. I'm your host, Sean Meyers, joined for a very special interview by guest Rennie Detore. Rennie, thank you for taking time to talk a little bit about professional wrestling here. And before we get started, let me introduce you to our audience. You are a former professional wrestling writer for the Pittsburgh newspaper, the Tribune Review. You've been around the business, covering it, being a fan in some capacity for many, many years. So before we get into your professional work, I just want to kind of touch base on how you got into the world of professional wrestling. When did you first become a fan?
So I would have to say probably, as cliche as it sounds, probably right around WrestleMania 3. I know the Hulk Hogan phase, 1984, beating the Iron Sheik. I started watching him probably more around the Hogan-Andre time. I remember getting my hands on a, for you longtime fans, Coliseum videotape of WrestleMania 3 and just fell in love with all of it. You know, the way it was put together, the larger than life guys. But really, Hulk and Andre at WrestleMania 3 is what did it for me. I've been hooked ever since. We'll get into the other, the current product now. But as a kid, 7 years old, watching that, Hogan was just, I mean, he was a cartoon superhero come to life, and the rest was history. I just kept watching, and as a kid, it was everything.
You have me beat by a couple of years, but I think most people anywhere close to our age, it all goes back to Hulk Hogan in really some form. And I remember when I started watching in the very late 80s or maybe 1990, Hulk Hogan was still on top. He was still the man. And I know for at least an entire generation, he was really the starting point that got them into wrestling. It'll be interesting to see if people say the same thing about John Cena or Roman Reigns years from now, but that's another topic for another time. I had mentioned that you had covered wrestling for many years in your role with the Tribune Review, the Pittsburgh newspaper. Kind of expand upon that, what you did in that role, the years that you did that, and sort of how that evolved throughout time.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I started with the newspaper in 1996. I was 17, and of course, we were like kind of on the threshold of that second boom period with the Attitude Era and Nitro, and right around that time, of course, is when Hogan joined the NWO. That was a big deal. That kind of set the groundwork for the Monday Night Wars. So fast forward a year later, I was asked. They wanted to do wrestling in the newspaper. And I was like, wow, I'm shocked. But it was starting to gain the kind of momentum, Sean, that I'm sure you understand. Like, the ratings were so high. I mean, Nitro was huge. Raw was doing okay. And you couldn't ignore the fact that, wrestling was outdrawing the NFL on Monday nights collectively between both wrestling shows. So the decision was made to, we want to go in, we want to go in the wrestling business.
How exactly, as a teenager, did you find that position?
Did I work through it? Yeah, I would say that's always a good story. I was, I guess it would have been 17 going on 18 when I was asked to do this. And, it's tough because you're around a lot of guys that have been doing this a lot of years, writing specifically. And so it was not the easiest thing in the world to navigate. But I offered to write a sample, and that's really all it really turned into. Was the editor at the time he was from, ironically enough, he was from Michigan, the Detroit area. So he was familiar with, the Pontiac Silverdome and Hogan Andre from 10 years earlier. So he was a fan himself, and I said, well, let me write something and let me, tell me what you think. And I did that, and he loved it, and off we went. And it turned into a weekly column in the Sunday paper, a much younger version of myself, photo, and, it was exciting. I mean, I was just a kid, and I loved wrestling, and, I happened to, 1997 was right around the time where Austin was starting to get hot, about a year after the King of the Ring, when he won it. He had come back from that injury, when he had the SummerSlam injury with Lato and Hart. He got pile driven, he hurt his neck, and he was white hot on television, and was starting to gain some momentum for Raw, and the timing was perfect. And I was just a kid, and I enjoyed it, but I wrote well, and I'm sure that helped too. But so it was unique and it was fun. And if I can just paint a picture for you of being a lifelong fan and being 17 or 18 years old and being backstage at events and talking to wrestlers, and it's something that was important to me. It was really fun, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was a great experience, especially being that young.
Now, you had mentioned at the beginning you started writing columns. Were you basically just giving your opinion at the onset, and then it sort of morphed into you going to high-profile events in the area? What all did you do in addition to just writing from home every week, as you mentioned?
So it really kind of started, to your point, as giving my opinion, as a columnist typically does. I didn't have any sources at the time. I was just getting into, telling people what I thought at the barest bones. So as it started to develop, I gained a relationship with the WWF at the time, now WWE, of course, but I got in good with one of their media guys. We had a good relationship. Probably, I'd say, less than a year after I started, and it started to actually pick up some momentum with people reading it and writing in, and just the popularity of it started to pick up a little bit. So things started to kind of open up a little bit from there, with being able to go to shows, doing interviews over the phone with wrestlers, doing backstage stuff. Some of the wrestlers, in talking to them, particularly one instance with Kurt Angle, who's from Pittsburgh, of course, had mentioned that some guys, when they're in town, some of the chatter was regarding the column that was written the day before if they're running Raw on Monday, as an example. So it kind of just was, it turned into something that was more legitimate as time went on, because I started to develop more contacts, started to develop a reputation in the area when the WWE would come to town. They had a No Way Out pay-per-view, I want to say 1999, 2001-ish. And, WWE comes up to me and says, we're going to give you first dibs on who you want to talk to. So that's kind of when I knew it was starting to become more than just a teenager writing about, pro wrestling.
You had mentioned, going to pay-per-views. You had mentioned Kurt Angle as well. Kind of take me through some experiences that were either very positive and kind of took your breath away momentarily, or maybe ones where you were in an awkward situation where you didn't know exactly what you should be saying, or maybe crossed one of those unwritten lines in the world of professional wrestling even.
So the awkwardness part was, right out of the gate. And I can go back to the first time I went backstage at a show. This would have been in late 1998. They were doing a house show in Pittsburgh. And I had set up through the media relations department, which, is very tight when it comes to talent and getting people the opportunity to see them and do interviews. So I remember one of the Hebner twins stopped me when I was coming backstage. And he's probably all of about 5'4", 5'5", and just threw his arm up at me like a parking gate, and told me, "Who are you and what are you doing back here?" First thing out of his mouth. And I said, "Well, I'm here from the newspaper, and I'm doing some backstage stuff. You can check with my media guy that works for you." And he put his, I'm sure I can do this, he put this hand on my chest and pushed me back a couple steps. Nothing crazy, but stand right here. Don't move from this spot. So that was kind of awkward. It was my first time, and then,
At a house show, it seems kind of weird that they would care that much in a sense.
I don't know if it was kind of still protective of the business much more than they are now. I'm not really sure, but I know, I wasn't at the time, had no relationship with them at all. And I remember having to call my contact and say, I don't think they're going to let me come in. And he said, well, let me make a couple calls. So long story short, Dave Hebner came back out, and behind him was Mark Henry. So I kind of knew at that point he maybe had heard that I was, good to go and was legit. But that first time backstage, I remember I interviewed Mark Henry, really nice guy, kind of he's very protective of the business, even though he'd only been in it for at that point 2 years. But then after that, I interviewed The Rock, and that was a really great experience because for those who can remember 1998, he was. Let's just real quick go back in '96 when he debuted. He was a babyface, and then he kind of went around into that heel part after he got hurt, joined the Nation of Domination. Then probably around '98 is when he kind of started to kind of peak a little bit, where people were starting to cheer him as kind of a cool bad guy. So beginning to talk to him, I feel like I got a chance to talk to a guy that was really down to earth at that point, had not experienced any kind of meteoric success in the business yet. So it was a much more candid interview than you probably would get from him, well, obviously now, but even just like a year later when he was in the corporation, he won the world title. This was, a different guy than you probably would see now. He was very humble. Not that he isn't at the moment, but he was just a different kind of guy to talk to in the wrestling business at that point. He was just trying to find his way. And you could see him working intently backstage, even though it's a house show. So this guy shows you the work ethic that he has and still does, working diligently on what he's going to say, how he's going to walk out. Those guys, and I don't want to talk out of school, but they're the ones that get it and want to do well at it are always doing something to get better. And you could see that from him right away. And again, this was well before he was, the People's Champ, the Great One, all that stuff. He was just kind of still Rocky Maivia morphing into The Rock.
And at that time, he was probably only a couple of years older than you, right?
Oh, geez, let's see, 98, I would have been 19. So
he was probably maybe 24 or so, 25.
Let's see, 72, so he'd have been 26 at that time. So, yeah, there really wasn't much of an age difference, but he, again, he very, he wasn't certainly a character, not that I would have expected that, but he was definitely a guy that was talking about just wanting to be successful and feeling like you could kind of see a little bit in him that he kind of felt like he had got it now. And of course, not to sound cliche, but he just kind of took off from there and the rest was history. But it was a unique experience to talk to him right before they strapped that rocket to his back, an old pro wrestling term, and then just kind of let him run with it.
So you talked about meeting Mark Henry, The Rock. Anything else that stands out as something that, if someone comes up to you and says, what was your number one highlight in your years covering professional wrestling? Anything that trumps that?
Yeah, I mean, wow. The Rock thing was kind of, at the time, was kind of just, he was, a guy on the rise. I look back on it now and, it was a really, it was an important time, an important moment, in my writing career, wrestling-wise. I would say probably the comment that Kurt Angle made that the guys within the business at that time, had talked about, the stuff that I was writing. I think talking to and doing an interview with Hulk Hogan over the phone right around the time that Hogan Knows Best was coming out, I remember getting a call from the same media contact I've had the whole time, and he said, "You want to talk to Hogan? I can get him to you in 10 minutes if you're ready." And I said, "Absolutely." I mean, this was 2005. Who isn't going to want to have a talk and do an interview with, a guy at the time that, had a hit show and, was still somebody that I thought was good for the business. So, that was a really, special moment. It kind of all came full circle at that point, from the Coliseum videotape to being able to interview him over the phone. Had great relationships with, did interviews with Big Show and Foley and, Mysterio, so, I can't say if anything really trumped the Rock thing other than maybe the Hogan interview. And, of course, seeing at that same show with The Rock and interviewing him, seeing Austin and Undertaker, probably about 3 months removed from their 1998 SummerSlam pay-per-view match, just sitting in the back, talking, playing cards, joking around. Not that we don't all know that happens, but I thought that was kind of cool too.
You said, The Rock wasn't a huge star and was, very helpful in talking to you. Was there anyone that was real difficult where you just couldn't get anything out of them? They just seemed disinterested in talking to this young upstart writer?
To be honest, like there really wasn't a whole lot of guys that there weren't a whole lot of guys that were really difficult. I kind of think they know it comes with the territory, especially when you're at a show. I think a couple guys that come to mind, and again, really dropping some names. A wrestler by the name of Bull Buchanan. I don't know if a lot of guys would remember him or not. He kind of had a bunch of different stints, different characters.
He was with John Cena a little bit later in his career.
Yeah, I think he had tagged along with when Cena came out with the heel rapper thing.
Yep.
Wasn't he part of that?
Yes.
I think?
Yes, he was.
But he was one that, this was again, he came out, very short to the point. And to be honest with you, with all due respect to him, it wasn't like I was exactly thrilled to interview Bull Buchanan, and he wasn't exactly doing much at that point. But I think the typical interview style was, they would give you one guy that they knew you didn't care about, and then they would try to, if you hung around long enough, they'd give you somebody that was good. So him, Steven Regal was, again, he was okay, but again, I can respect the fact that the guy is, a product of the business from, doing shows and making $40 a week, and he just is one of those guys that just, it's his job. I can respect that. People don't come to my job now and, put a tape recorder in my face and go, hey, what do you think about, this week's paycheck? Like, I don't know, like whatever. So I can respect that. So those kind of guys stick out for me, but everybody was really nice. Everybody was very cordial, and of course, it got a lot easier the more I hung around doing the job. I did it for 7 years, from 98 to 05. So by the time 2005 rolled around, it was, I was a face that they knew, and, going backstage and doing that type of stuff wasn't a big deal at that point.
So from the time you started to the time you finished, you probably saw a significant change in the role of professional wrestling journalists, or even insiders, if you will, which is kind of a vague term. But I remember I first started reading wrestling rumors online right around 1999, I want to say, 98, 99. I was in high school in 99, and I think that's probably the time that I started. Yes, I watched every week, and I had been watching every week for almost a decade at that point. But that's when I started to kind of learn, the backstage secrets, the news, things of, superstars debuting. I remember it was not a surprise when Chris Jericho debuted in WWF because it had been reported. But for the people who didn't read the rumors back then, which was a lot of fans, it came as a huge surprise. In your time from when you started to when you finished, and now more than a decade after that, how have you seen the role of insiders, wrestling journalists, dirt sheet writers? How has that changed?
Well, you go all the way back to, before I even started writing, there was the pro wrestling, newsletters and, the dirt sheets and things like that would really, and everybody knows at this point that those things were fueled by wrestlers. I think that's a pretty common understanding now. The guys like the Meltzers and the Wade Kellers of the world, they got that stuff from wrestlers. So part of it was, I think wrestling and the way it's being covered, or the journalistic standpoint of it, it really turned into a mainstream entity, right around the time that it got popular, and it became cover of TV Guide, and I think wrestling is one of those things where when it's popular and the ratings are huge, it becomes something that you can't overlook. So from a journalist standpoint, I think when you look at it now, now they talk about WrestleMania when there's a media row, where there's people covering it from different newspapers and different forums, social media now. But I think it's really grown into being more of legitimized based on the fact that you just can't ignore the TV ratings, despite the fact that they're down at this point. They're still high for cable television. So I think the late 90s and kind of wrestling pulling back the curtain a little bit with the Attitude Era and being more realistic, People wanted to talk about, like how it's not like dirt sheets anymore. It's not an insider type business, and they kind of did that, by their own hand. If you think about how it was booked in the late '90s, things felt more real. The stories felt more creative. Guys were just being themselves. So I think to answer that question, it's not so much what the journalists did. It was the way the business evolved. It kind of changed the landscape of how we covered it. We took it as more an entertainment piece that some of us, like myself, would cover, more for the people that enjoyed it on that storytelling basis and the character basis and the news, and then of course there's another level to it now where, people cover it as an entertainment and global entity that, it's just, you just can't ignore it now. So
that being said, my feel is the job you were doing in the late '90s, talking about being backstage in 1998, you providing that service was really probably the only way that a lot of people in the Pittsburgh area were going to find out the backstage news, maybe some breaking stories about professional wrestling. Whereas now, anyone that has Twitter is going to find out wrestling news if, basically it's one click away and it's accessible all across the globe by everyone. So do you feel like the role of someone who is, covering wrestling in a, journalistic fashion like you did is sort of diminished in its importance now because that information's just so out there for everybody that it's almost hard to avoid spoilers at this point for stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, when I was doing what I was doing, you're right, there wasn't a whole lot in terms of, information being swapped. So a lot of times if I reported on something like this person's jumping ship or going to a different company or this person's going to debut, it was news at that point. So, what I did and how I wrote, and the things that I reported on a weekly basis would very much be outdated right now. Having said that, I think there is still a forum for, people who know the business and understand it, that can talk and write about it from a commentary perspective. I don't think in some ways I think there's too much of that, and in other ways I don't think there's enough of it. Everybody that has a social media page can talk about how, Kenny Omega and Okada it's a 1,700 stars, and, but they don't, they're just going by what they hear. So everybody has a forum now that they can report on that stuff. So, again, I think the wrestling journalist role is kind of faded a little bit, other than, the mainstays. We've kind of been turned into, what TiVo and, did for, not having to be there to watch a television show. We kind of got phased out a little bit in that respect. But I think if you know what you're talking about and you're credible, you still have a place for it. But it's from a news standpoint, I completely agree with you. There's really not much we can do or could have done as a journalist on a weekly basis now. It just wouldn't work.
So we've talked a little bit about the changes in how the media covers professional wrestling and that relationship. What changes have you seen, not only in your time working in the business, but just as a fan overall, in terms of the product of WWE or the wrestling industry altogether? Because right now, while WWE is still king, there's plenty of other options for people that can't necessarily get enough of professional wrestling.
Yeah, there was a time, and I'm sure, Sean, you can remember, where, when it was WWE and WCW, you had Monday Night Raw and Nitro, you had Tuesday was, sometimes it was SmackDown, sometimes Friday was SmackDown, you had Thunder on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Really, WCW Saturday Night, Shotgun Saturday Night was the WWE product. They had Sunday Night Heat. So you look at the business now, and it was so, they got fat, rich, and happy. They flooded the market with way too much coverage. They didn't have enough good content, to be able to go and do all these different shows, and, from the syndicated pieces to, the live stuff. And when you look at it now, I know that most people who are wrestling fans are very, down on the product right now. And I can't say that I disagree with that, but it's the natural ebb and flow of how this business works. You look at, the boom period in the 80s, with Hogan and Andre and Savage and Steamboat and Flair and the NWA contingency, and then it kind of just died out a little bit. The early '90s, and everybody remembers the 1993-94 time period, which was awful. If you look back at WrestleMania 9 and 10 and 11, I mean, those shows were horrible. But then it kind of picked back up again. So, I think really the big thing about the product now is there's no competition for the WWE, and then they don't force themselves to be better. Say what you want about WCW and Bischoff and that group being, very successful for a very short amount of time, but the competition piece is, the WWE thinks they're competing with Walt Disney, and it's a joke. I mean, they are so off on what they're doing now that I think, they lost that sense of urgency and purpose with their product. Everybody wants to talk about it's PG. I don't buy into that as much. I mean, I know going public probably didn't help with, the content-wise, but, just like the Attitude Era, they couldn't have sustained that kind of programming forever. Things change. I think that there's nothing out there right now that they consider, competing with them. And I have to laugh when I hear, podcasts with Vince McMahon and, when he talks about guys like Cesaro and, others that are talented. I mean, if you look at this roster in the WWE specifically, there's a lot of talent there. Styles and Joe and Bryan, Daniel Bryan and Kevin Owens and, Cesaro. I mean, those are guys that, if you recall, fans that were around 5, 7, 10 years ago, there's no way you'd ever see Joe in WWE. You never see Styles in WWE. They wouldn't fit. These are guys that were tearing up Ring of Honor and the Indies and, TNA to some degree. And, they have all this talent at their disposal, and, there's nothing pushing them to be better from a company standpoint. And although I feel like that's changing a little bit with the influx of some of the other wrestling companies that are gaining a little bit of momentum, specifically New Japan.
How often do you watch professional wrestling? How often do you watch WWE? And what do you like and dislike about the current product? Like, I know you said obviously the talent is certainly there, but it seems overall it's still not meeting your expectations.
Well, I mean, it's funny because if let's just go back to the Attitude Era when it was huge. Okay, you had Austin, you had Rock, you had Taker, you had Kane. McMahon, of course, was a big catalyst in that. But then you look at some of the other guys that were there. Let's just think about this for a second. You had Billy Gunn and Road Dogg. Neither one of them were great. I would consider them talented in terms of what they do in the ring. You had guys that had been around for a long time, like Jeff Jarrett. You had a lot of filler. You had the Godfather and Val Venus, and Goldust was still hanging around. I don't know. They brought Shamrock in for a little bit, and I don't know if I would look at that roster. Like Triple H, of course, was coming into his own, and you saw Foley was around, and so they had some guys. I mean, it wasn't that, but once you got past that layer of top talent, there wasn't much in the way of workers. So I think the talent is there. I think that the problem is the booking. They trade wins. Nobody really stands out. 1 week, when I do watch it, 1 week, Bobby Roode, beats, Dolph. And then next week, Dolph gets the win back. And then the following week, they just trade wins. I guess I lost the memo when it was okay or not okay anymore to just either win or lose. It just doesn't work for me that nobody stands out. And guys are miscast. Bobby Roode's a heel. Bobby Lashley's a heel. Right now, they're both on the opposite side. They're both baby faces. So I don't think they really know a lot what to do with the guys that they have. They trade wins, and the content of the program is just very flat. It seems rehearsed. There's nothing about it that sounds real. And I realize that's a kind of an ironic term to use with something that's predetermined, but it just, the stuff that's being written for these guys is being written way, way out into left field. It's not connecting with anybody. So as much as McMahon and company want to say nobody's taking the reins and doing anything about it, Cesaro needs to step up or this person needs to step up, that's fine. You've given them a platform, but you're forcing content on them that sounds canned, and people just don't care. And I think that's the problem. And maybe not right now, but they're going to have a big problem on their hands if New Japan starts to get more and more into the States. They already have an event booked for Madison Square Garden
the weekend of SummerSlam
next year. So if they sleep on them, that would be foolish. And I don't think Vince McMahon is foolish, although he might be just a little bit burned out at this point.
So the one thing that you mentioned that I absolutely despise is when Vince says someone needs to grab the brass ring or break through the glass ceiling, because it seems like when guys get a natural following, kind of getting over on their own is the term that people use, the company really, for the most part, doesn't get behind those type of people. It seems like they want to create the stars and not have the fans determine who the stars are. And while they're right a lot of the time, they're also wrong some of the time. And it seems like they've become very stubborn with their decisions is what they're going to stick with almost no matter what.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I think the stubbornness comes from, ego. I think, this is a company with a long standing of we've created the best talent in the business, with Hogan and Austin and Cena and Rock and, some of the other guys that are benchmark, talent. But if you really look a little bit deeper, and this is conversations I have with, people quite a bit about the product in general is, I'm not saying that Vince McMahon doesn't have talent. He's a tremendous promoter, marketer, great businessman that you have to be as successful as him. But let's not overlook the fact that Austin winning King of the Ring was a fluke. Triple H was punished for the Madison Square Garden incident with the Click, and he was supposed to win. So the Austin thing fell in his lap, not to mention the fact that Austin was being booked consistently to lose to Bret, and they force-fed Bret Hart as a babyface against a surging Austin. So, I don't know what happened to the company because McMahon has been there the whole time. So he's the one piece that's never changed. And there was a guy who, if you look back at WrestleMania with Austin and Hart, and that was WrestleMania 13, 1997, that double turn was one of the best pieces of business that they've done in the last 30 years. But that's a guy that realized, Bret Hart is not being cheered. Austin is a superstar and a babyface waiting to happen. So he made the decision to listen to the audience. So I'm not sure, Sean, what happened from 1997 to 2018, where, to your point, Daniel Bryan, old habit, he comes back from retirement after being off for years, never going to wrestle again. Guy's white hot. What's he doing now? He's teaming with Kane. And I realize he hasn't signed a new contract. Okay, I get that. But, at the end of the day, if he signs a new deal and he's still doing what he's doing with the Bludgeon Brothers, no offense, and with a guy who has retired 14 times in the last, year and a half, it's just ridiculous. I mean, they have to be better at understanding. There no longer is anybody there, at least from what you can tell by the product, that understands what the company wants. And I'll go back just a year ago with Joe challenging Lesnar. That was a feud that, people really got behind. And I give Lesnar some credit for being an absolute bump machine for Joe, in those matches. But it was a great physical feud. It was a great match. And it happened at the July pay-per-view last year, and then it was gone. And it had nothing to do with anybody being hurt. They just moved on from it and right back into something else that's stale. They never, ever try to do anything or push any envelopes or any buttons that work anymore. So again, they've been coasting for a long time on fumes. There's no competition for them. There's no other product. But again, if one does start to pull things together, and I think that's happening under their nose, they're going to have some issues. Particularly with, again, not to keep mentioning New Japan, but this is a company that's ready to spend and get some notoriety and to push into the States. And they have quite a bit of talent and they know how to use it. So I would be concerned.
Let me ask you this. You've mentioned some things you don't like about WWE in particular. If you took over for Vince McMahon, what is the one thing above all else that you would change?
I would get rid of, I don't know if it's Hollywood writers or script writers, or I guess I missed the time period when not that Vince Russo wasn't that to a degree. I mean, this was a guy that went under the pseudonym of Vic Benham in the WWF magazine in 1994 and became a television writer. But people have made this comment over and over again that, Russo was an idea guy. He threw stuff at the wall that was ridiculous, and some of it McMahon used and some he filtered through his machine. So there's too many, I'm guessing, yeah, this is just my opinion, I'm guessing there's way too many people telling way too many guys what to say, what to do, and how they should be acting on television. When, if you look at the success of the most recent Attitude Era, it was a lot of guys doing and saying the things that, really kind of just how they felt. And again, with The Rock is a perfect example. Someone told him, and this has been documented by Bruce Pritchard and anybody else that's ever known him or worked with him. Hey, Rock, you just got hurt. You came back. People are booing the hell out of you. Go out there and tell them what you think. Sounds good to me. I mean, why does it have to be written verbatim? So if I was running it, I would go back to, getting some more of a channel in place where I would, filter ideas that make sense, let guys go out there and fail if that's what it takes. Because, if you're not trying to be different or trying to go above and beyond this canned rhetoric that they're using, it's never going to get any better. And I think that's really the problem. And the irony, Sean, is that, this is a company that produces NXT, which, and this is not a cheap plug for that show, that is one of the better put together wrestling shows, whether it's their weekly show or their takeover shows. That's some of the best wrestling you'll probably never see from a company that, if you watch their main roster shows, looks like they don't know how to book wrestling at all.
Interesting that we talked about how you would maybe change the writers or their roles and things. Don't want to take too much time on this, but I think it's interesting. You have a background with that. You, at one point, reached out to WWE, WWF, whatever it was at the time, about becoming a writer for them, and they kind of put you through a little bit of a test to determine that. Give a brief synopsis of how that went and what the company really required.
So this was probably 99, I think. So I would have been 20. And they asked me to write 2 storylines. And, the storylines were specific. I wish I had the letter from Stephanie McMahon. I don't keep it handy, although I probably should.
You don't have it framed behind you, just off camera?
Maybe up until probably 2003, I had kept it somewhere close, but I still have it. I just don't know where it is. But I'll get back to you on that. But they basically wanted a story that was X number of words, and they said you have to. And I always thought this was kind of funny. This was probably, they said no knives, no one gets killed. All of the conflict has to end up be settled in the ring. So anything that you wrote for them had to have a backstory and dialogue and all of the things that would anything backstage interactions, just written like a movie script. The funny part about it is that everything had to end in the ring, and I wrote two storylines for them, and it at least appeared to me, again, this is my opinion, that while I obviously did not get the job as a writer, although I was one of the last 2 people that were being considered, a couple versions of those stories seemed to rear their heads on television, but that's all I'll go into about that. But they do want, it's a lot of detail, and I think, again, there's nothing wrong with guys like coming up with ideas for talent. That I don't want to misunderstand what I'm saying. Like, I'm not saying you should have every single piece of talent come to you and say, this is what I want to do tonight. Because then it turns into a WCW where everybody thinks they're the boss, and the guy who is the boss just doesn't care anymore. I'm talking about guys like, that understand, and I'm not throwing back to Jim Cornette where, you got to have, powder and fireball. That's not where I'm going with this. It's just, you got to have guys with some kind of wrestling action.
I think Paul Heyman has been added to one of the writing teams, I believe Raw, recently, and he seems like a perfect guy even though he's 15 years removed from ECW, he gets the business as well as anyone probably.
Well, and he's a perfect example. I realized that he and McMahon have a history. He and Stephanie McMahon have a history. Heyman's never been the kind of guy that's really worked well with them. But if you think about it, that's the kind of person I think, and maybe Heyman's past that point in his career where he has something to prove and he's going to get edgy. But I do think he understands, to your point, he understands the business enough that he can write for it and come up with ideas for talent that make sense and kind of give them a little bit of a creative leeway. I'm not saying we have to go back to, the language and, all the stuff that happened in the Attitude Era, but I'm sorry, but, when I'm watching Raw and my wife is watching it with me and she's saying to me that this is ridiculous, like, these guys, you can tell they're not saying this like as if it's their words, or, it looks ridiculous, it doesn't feel legitimate, like, and that's somebody that doesn't watch it or has not watched it for, the 30 years I've been watching it. So if it's obvious to somebody who's mainstream, like a mainstream fan potentially, I mean, what more can you say? Like, they need wrestling minds writing for wrestling.
And Paul Heyman always said in ECW he wanted to cater to guys' strengths and sort of hide or limit situations where their weaknesses would show. And I think that's kind of to your point where some people are being miscast. Nakamura is on the microphone every single week, whether it be backstage or in the ring. Why? Why does he need to talk every week? Some guys don't have to always cut promos. Some guys don't have to wrestle every single week if they're great on the mic, but not tremendous in the ring. It seems like they want everyone to do everything, or else they don't want them on at all.
Or the stuff that they're doing is just, it's very cookie cutter. Even the wrestling oriented stuff, Sean, like, I'll give you an example. And again, it's nothing against, this particular piece of talent. But, like, you look at a guy like Mojo Rawley coming out on Raw. Like, when he comes out, like, it's that collective groan of, like, here you have, you have Balor, you have Drew McIntyre, you have all these guys, and I'm sure there's a purpose for them. Don't get me wrong, but, like, here's a guy that comes out and he's winning squash matches. I mean, if they truly believe that this guy is something or can be something, then fine. But, it's too much of, you look at a guy like Zack Ryder, and I'm not a big Zack Ryder fan. I appreciate the fact that he got himself over and he never really got, the sustained push that he probably deserved. But, then you look at a guy like Mojo Rawley, it's like, well, we're just going to bring him out on TV. He's going to win some squash matches. Nobody knows who he is, what he wants to do. They stopped and started with him so many times. Okay, it doesn't matter anymore. And there's too much of that. Like, guys show up. You look at the day after WrestleMania, guys show up. Bobby Roode, Ember Moon, like, all these people show up. And then they're hot for a few minutes, and then it's like, a couple shows, they're still getting good ovations, good pops, and then it just goes away because they don't do anything with them. You mentioned Nakamura. What about Asuka? What happened there? Undefeated for 2.5 years. She loses. I think it was to Charlotte, I believe.
Yeah, WrestleMania.
I appreciate that WrestleMania match between those two, and then she drops 2 matches in a row to Carmella. Like, I mean, and I'm not going to get into the weeds with this, but what is that? Where does that even come from? She should be mowing people down, and being prepped for someone like a Rousey. Like, now she's a joke. The crowd doesn't care, and why would they? Same with Nakamura. Guy was a legitimate, talent in New Japan for years, and he is and this is what WWE does. They dumb everything down. He's a caricature of himself, where no speak English. Like really, we're back to this now. Like, I mean, is he going to team up with the Great Kabuki or Hakushi next week? Like, I mean, this is what they do. Like, it's silly to me. With all that talent and there's still nothing's firing properly. I just don't get it.
Let's go real quick. Word association. First thing that comes to mind for these people. Roman Reigns.
Miscast.
Overall, do you like him?
I may be on the minority with this, but I think he does try hard, and I do think when you hear when you see bits and pieces of when he gets the chance to talk like Roman Reigns, like just the guy, and he has that little bit of a chip, like I see what they're trying to do with him, but I think the best thing for Roman Reigns is to, everyone's like, oh, just turn him heel. I don't care if he's a heel or a baby face, but stop booking him wrong, and I think that's where your issue is. You want him to go out there and pander, and people pick up on that right away. So I like him. I think he could potentially have done more, but I have a feeling he's so damaged now that I don't know if there's any recovering from him other than him selling T-shirts to 14-year-old kids.
Brock Lesnar.
I would say freak athlete. He's one of those rare guys that can pick and choose when he wants to come and go. I'm a little tired of him, not sure what he wants to do anymore. That was good back in 2002 when he wanted to be a Minnesota Viking, or he wanted to, have his own Learjet and didn't want to wrestle anymore and did the UFC thing. Like, I can appreciate his duality with how he is because of the kind of athlete he is. But the guy's just, he's a freak athlete and he'll always have a place. Whether people like the fact that he's, going back and forth, that's what you get to do when you're, that kind of a name.
AJ Styles.
I'm not going to say phenomenal because that's very cliche, but he's, remarkable. He's a remarkable talent. And I think the thing with AJ is, to be as good as he is in the ring at 41 and not missing a beat, the guy's a conditioning freak. But the big thing with him is I give him a lot of credit for coming from TNA and coming to the WWE and being the guy. And whether they want to admit it or not, he is the guy. I mean, so a lot of people didn't think that was possible, that he could have transitioned into the WWE. He was always considered probably a guy that they wouldn't have any interest in, so good for him.
Seth Rollins.
Finally clicking. I think the Rollins, he's another guy. I don't know how, Sean, he made it through this horrific booking that he was given for years. Him beating Triple H was a start. He still gets a good reaction when people come out, but unfortunately, he's another guy that, why is he not in the world title mix? Fans like him, they respect him, and what is he doing? What, Ziggler? I mean, I think when you consider that, like, I'd rather see him and McIntyre feuding in a #1 contenders match for the world title. So he's finally clicking in the sense that people will outright just love to cheer the guy and they respect him, but he's a product of bad booking too.
Braun Strowman.
Underrated. I think Strowman is one of those guys when he debuted that everybody just tossed him aside as being another strong guy who, Triple H bumped into at an Arnold Classic or whatever, however they met or however he got in there. I know he wasn't a wrestler, but he's a guy that hard worker. I think he's very underrated in terms of what he can do as an athlete, and he's another person that I felt like they were really close with him, and then he loses to Lesnar clean in a very mundane match, and then I'm not really sure where they lost him along the way. But again, like Rollins, he still connects. He's just there.
Elias. Surprise.
He's a guy that, and I say this all the time, I have plenty of people who watch wrestling and love it, and they look at Elias, again, from their perspective, and they're like, I can't understand how a guy who, was in NXT and didn't necessarily translate in that arena, per se, comes to WWE, and the guy is, again, he's someone I'm waiting to break out, to be perfectly honest, because he has the verbal skills. And I tell them all the time, in NXT, he was what he was. The guy is tailor-made for their main roster right now. Whether that's a good or bad thing based on our conversation of what the main roster looks like and how it's comprised and booked. But I'm pleasantly surprised that a guy like that was able to, NXT is always about the work rate and things like that, and having 7-star matches. And not that he didn't have those, but I think he's a guy that translates better on the main roster. He gets it from the character piece, and he's a throwback. People cheer him, and then he insults them. That's been done, but he does it well. So, I'm pleasantly surprised that, I guess I'm surprised that he's clicked to the point he has, but then again, in some ways I'm not surprised based on how he's structured.
Last name, Ronda Rousey.
Work in progress. I think people who give her flack for not really wanting to be here, like WWE is a second option, well, guess what? Get in line. Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, Tank Abbott. Let's be realistic.
Well, you're saying MMA people. You could say the same about the football players.
Kevin Green, Lawrence Taylor, Steve McMichael. Let's call it what it is. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but when the WWE themselves goes out and says we just signed 15 new developmental talents and 7 of them were in the NFL, they kind of are already doing that quietly on their own. So why you don't, the WWE took a name and is trying to make them their own, and I can appreciate that. I think she tries hard. Do I think her heart's in it completely? Not really, but I do think she's giving effort. She's better. When you look at that match she had with Nia Jax, the one-on-one match, she was ready. She did well, and so she's enough of an athlete like a Lesnar that she'll get it. Whether or not she's going to be around for 5 or 10 years, I don't think it matters. The WWE is more now about splash than substance, and whether it's Rousey or just garnering headlines however they can, but the product in and of itself is suffering as a result.
Well, Rennie, I appreciate the time. As I warned you in the email, sometimes we go longer than anticipated, but I think all this was good stuff. And much like Bob Orquist, Bobby O, that we had on previously, I would love to have you on again down the road to talk more about pro wrestling, to get a little bit more into your background, but also just your thoughts. Maybe next time we'll ask what the future of pro wrestling should be in your mind. But we're out of time here, so I want to thank you for taking the time and joining us, and definitely we will have you back in the future here on the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. Had fun.
All right, that's going to do it. Remember, if you want to check us out on Twitter, the handle right here, 5-Star Pod Wrestle, you could go to our YouTube page, like our channel, where we have all of the episodes, both the Raw recap and the SmackDown summary this week, as well as this special interview. But for Rennie Detore, this is Sean Meyers signing off. We'll see you next week here on the 5-Star Podcast of Wrestling.